Hello everyone, once again from the dystopian capitalist hellscape of the United Kingdom, and we aren't quite in cyberpunk territory, but today we are once again talking about the cyberpunk genre, racism, Orientalism, and all that stuff because of a recent film I saw, The Creator, by Gareth Edwards. Now, a lot of you people will not have seen this movie. It's actually projected to do pretty poorly, but it's what inspired this video, and I am going to talk about this movie a bit later on. And I'm not going to spoil the central plot. I'm really going to spoil like the premise and some things that happen because I want to talk about the context of this world that is built in The Creator and how it really resembles the worst of Orientalist tropes of not only cyberpunk but also United States war movies, because it kind of blends the two of like all the missteps in United States war movies and how it treats the victims of imperialism. But also it's interesting in that it does that while being a massive critique of US imperialism, because the underlying message of this movie is a pretty good one. But the aesthetics of it all, whether that be the Vietnam War, despite it being set in 2070, or whether that be cyberpunk, are like some of the worst I've seen in a long, long time. And it kind of shows you someone like Gareth Edwards appears to be like a fairly like progressive filmmaker, but because he comes from a background like the United Kingdom, he's made a lot of these mistakes, and it feels like no one really looked over this film and thought, you know, why are we in Vietnam and there's just like loads of Chinese writing everywhere? Why is it never specified like what country this is even in? Why do we not know where we are? Like, characters are speaking Vietnamese, and then they're speaking Thai, and then they're speaking Japanese, and it's like the whole place, I'm not even joking, the whole of Asia is called New Asia and it's one country. In this film, you might as well just call it the Orient. It's literally that bad. But don't worry, we're going to talk about that a bit later. But to start with, we're going to talk about things like techno-Orientalism and just give people who might not have watched my previous videos on this kind of like the background on why cyberpunk as a genre has this real like baked-in racism. Doesn't mean everyone who creates stuff in cyberpunk is a massive racist, but when the original works of Neuromance, Blade Runner, and even the cyberpunk tabletop have this anti-Asian sentiment kind of baked in, it's hard to get away from that. And I saw some people on Twitter act like, you know, I was accusing like cyberpunk of being racist in terms of like the fans are all racist, and that's just not true. Like, I love cyberpunk. It's probably like my favorite little subgenre. Look, I have like Night City like postcards that I got with the pre-order of Cyberpunk 2077. I have Blade Runner posters, Blade Runner 2049 and the original, my favorite movie, Cyberpunk 2077, one of my favorite games. Like, I absolutely love this genre as a whole, and that's why it's fun to dissect like how it came to be this way, and also how certain pieces of media kind of address the Orientalism. Like 2049 is more inspired by Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and Russia than it is by Japan or anything. And I find that super interesting, and it shows how cyberpunk is kind of moving away from the inbuilt xenophobia towards, you know, Japanese people, but also East Asians and Southeast Asians in general. So gonna speak about all of that today. Please like the video, and in the comments, let me know what your favorite cyberpunk piece of media is. Bonus points if you can point to something that most people don't know about, because I'm always interested in learning more. And also, here's something I'm gonna ask people. Is there any cyberpunk that has come out of Southeast Asia recently, like maybe on Vietnamese TV or Thai TV or Thai cinema? Because I'm very interested to see like kind of new interpretations of cyberpunk from countries that haven't been as influential in like film, television, anime like Japan and America have. So if you got any of those recommendations, stick them in the comments. Also follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter, on Instagram, on Blue Sky, on Threads. Consider becoming a patron. Benefits include access to the Discord server, access to my Nintendo Switch friend code, and access to old exclusive content. And also check out the subreddit and check out my second channel. The links to everything down in the description. So before we go any further, I guess I should say why I was attracted to the cyberpunk genre, because it's not something I've always loved. I hadn't even watched Blade Runner, the original one, until 2015. I always liked Coruscant in Star Wars, and that's not really Asian inspired. I did always like that city vibe. And then with Blade Runner, you get something that is, you know, kind of like Coruscant. You know, it's clear it has a very Asian, mainly Japanese influence too. And there's something about that film, Like Vangelis's score, the rain, and I just like instantly loved it straight away. Like one of my favorite movies straight away. And then I was so hyped for the second one, completely met and exceeded my expectations. Love that movie as well. And then from there, I've just been really into it. And like Cyberpunk 2077 really does a lot of the things I love so much about those movies. But even with that, I'm kind of like wrestling with my own kind of views on Asia, because I'm like, well, why do I like this? Do I like it because I buy into like this techno-Orientalism? And that's an interesting question to ask myself. And before a year ago, I'd only left Europe for one day in my whole life, and I actually went to live in Southeast Asia. I lived in Vietnam for 3 months, Thailand for 2 and a bit months, and Cambodia for 2 months. And I also went to Japan and Korea. You know, progressives like us, leftists like us, we view things with nuance. Like, you know, if you look into the issues of, you know, Thailand, Vietnam, you can understand the differences either in the culture or differences in the language or how things look and everything. But it's not until you actually go there that you like really understand the differences between these countries. Like with Southeast Asia in particular, you have Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia all bordering each other, right? Cambodia in the middle. And these 3 countries have 3 different political systems, 3 different economies, and they just feel completely different. Like Bangkok compared to Hanoi is so different. Phnom Penh compared to Hanoi or Bangkok, so different. The way it looks, the way it feels. Hanoi being like extremely chaotic, but having all these old French colonial buildings or Soviet style kind of mega block stuff. And then you have the bikes everywhere, you have the trees everywhere. Phnom Penh being like far newer, does really have like a futuristic look to it. Like I had an apartment there which looked upon the cityscape, and it's the most I've ever thought something looked like a cyberpunk city, Phnom Penh, which is weird because you don't think about that when it comes to cyberpunk. And then Bangkok was just like insane to me. Like the skyscrapers were so massive, the architecture was so cool to look at, and also like living in these countries, not just like visiting them, like having to do like boring stuff like, you know, shopping, like just like living your life there makes you really appreciate how things are different, and especially how chaotic Vietnam is, especially like Hanoi. And that's what I find interesting about The Creator, which we're going to talk later, because Gareth Edwards clearly likes these countries. He's been to all of them, but you wonder how much time he actually spent on them, because if you spent a lot of time there, maybe you'd realise you want to portray the differences between these countries and not lump them all in. And yeah, I went to Tokyo as well, more as like a touristy thing over 10 days, and I went to Seoul in Korea. But if you open your eyes to it and you pay attention, you can see the differences between all these cultures very clearly. But also loads of things in your mind about certain countries then get challenged. Like, I didn't know Korea was so Christian. Most religious people in Korea are Christians, which is insane to me. Like, I never knew that. We went to Myeongdong, which is like the Catholic area, and seeing Catholic churches all over like this East Asian country and so many people being Christians was really weird to me. Stuck out even more than like the Catholic churches in places like Hanoi as well. The French colonized, you know, this place. Loads of buildings still look French. The whole Vietnamese written language is influenced by the French language and, you know, the English alphabet and stuff. So yeah, that was all really interesting, and I'm so happy I did it. And I feel I'm like more knowledgeable on these different cultures, how they're different, even how the languages sound different to me. Of course, I don't understand any of them, but they all sound different. And I'm happy I did that because yeah, we all know they're different. We all can see they look different to some extent, but you don't really know it. And I guess that's probably similar maybe for Asian tourists who go to Europe as well. Like, how is England and Ireland different? How is England and France different? France and Germany, all these countries that border each other. Like, in their head, maybe they're like, oh, Europeans, you know, they all kind of seem quite similar. Political systems are quite similar, all in the European Union. But once you go there, you realize they aren't. And I'm sure a lot of Americans watching this, whether it's Europe or parts of Asia, you have done that, and then you realize, oh yeah, these places aren't all the same. But now let's go into techno-Orientalism and just Orientalism in general. So Orientalism is, of course, that book by Edward Said. If you have done a political science at university, you have read this book. It is, you know, basic bitch political science. Not saying it's not good, because it is, but basically anyone who's done political science or history, you've read this book. And, you know, I can't summarize the whole book, but basically it takes the concept of the Orient in the colonizer's imagination. Now, the Orient was something they used to describe basically most colonized British territory, but it could stem from like Egypt to India to China, all lumped in together, the Orient. And basically what this book was outlining, how the knowledge of the Orient and colonized people in colonized countries always comes from the colonizer's perspective. So he had an example, I think it's in the first chapter, this guy called Lord Cromer, who was like the governor of Egypt. And once he stopped being the governor, he went back to England and he wrote loads of books on Egypt. And loads of people loved them, thought they were great, and they believed everything he said. When he wrote that Egyptians were lazy, sneaky, and cheats, everyone believed him. And that became the knowledge of the Orient and the knowledge of Egypt. Because the colonizers said all these racial stereotypes to people, and it created a certain perspective of Egypt. And this was done throughout, every country in the Orient. And it creates this colonizer view of these countries. And that's why we're going to talk about the creator, because I feel like this does the same thing. Now, techno-Orientalism actually expands upon this, because you have the Orientalism of how people still view Asia, and a lot of you guys might be aware of it from how people view Asian women, because that's influenced by US wars with Japan, in Korea, and occupying Japan as well, and having army bases there, and also the Vietnam War. So the US soldiers, of course, are stationed all around these countries, and yeah, they go to brothels, come back home, say a bunch of stuff about Asian women, and then you have this whole concept of yellow fever, where you have these racial stereotypes of mainly East Asian women coming from this long history of either imperialism or neo-imperialism by the United States. But it also dates back to the actual colonial period as well, and British and European stereotypes about East Asian women. But I was reading something good about techno-Orientalism, the history of this term. I thought it was a modern thing that came with the 2010s, but it's a lot older apparently. So techno-Orientalism started off as a research theme in the mid-1990s, initially defined as a cultural logic by Kevin Morley and David Robbins in 1995. It was later described by Toshiya Ueno in 2002 as a discursive phenomenon associated with the post-Fordist globalization and information-centered capitalism. Professors and media scholars David S. Rowe, Betsy Wong, and Dr. Greta A. New, in their book Techno-Orientalism, Imagining Asia in Speculative Fiction, History and Media, make the distinction further, saying, while Orientalism defines a modern West by producing a polar opposite and pre-modern East, Techno-Orientalism, symmetrically yet contradictorily, completes this project by creating a collective futurized Asia to further affirm the West's centrality. They further say the techno of techno-Orientalism then comes to signal Orientalism's relationship to economic globalization and Asianness characterized by the juxtaposition of cultural retrograde with technical hyper-advancement. Basically, it's imagining what Asian prejudice looks like in the future, economically and culturally. The colonialist perspective is the bedrock for the prejudice that underlies the genre, a futuristic dystopian world where the dominant economic East serves as the antagonist to the economic West. So just while I was reading that, I was thinking about the creator so much, because it literally is the textbook definition of techno-Orientalism. Now, one more thing to talk about before we go on to talking about the creator, as my little review of the politics of that film, is the racism and anti-Asian sentiment built into cyberpunk. So basically, the aesthetics of cyberpunk are massively influenced by Blade Runner. It came out in 1982, at a time where there was increasing xenophobia, mainly against Japan, for having a rising economy that they feared could usurp the United States as the global economic power. That's how much it was doing well for itself. Japanese consumer goods were everywhere. Japanese companies were getting massive, car companies, tech companies, and the US was scared that Japan would become maybe like what China is today, I guess. That's what the fear was. And the parallels are interesting there with how much, fear-mongering and anti-Chinese sentiment has driven anti-Asian sentiment in recent times. But in that, you basically have a world that is taken over by Japan. In Blade Runner, you have this massive, I think it's a geisha, on these billboards you see constantly. Seemingly there's a lot of Japanese stuff, but there's also a lot of Chinese stuff, because it's also inspired by Kowloon, that old slum in Hong Kong as well. So what it basically does is mesh these different Asian cultures together to create this visual aesthetic. But it is based on a time of xenophobia, about Asian peoples taking over the entire world, basically, which was built on US economic fears that they would be usurped as the main power in the world. And basically what you often see as well is corporations in this kind of cyberpunk media are kind of like state actors as well. Arasaka in Cyberpunk is the most powerful corporation in Japan, but it feels like in some ways a stand-in for Japan itself, because Mike Pondsmith created this world in the 1980s and was actually influenced by Blade Runner. He said himself, he influenced by Blade Runner in creating this world. And it's also Night City and the world of Blade Runner are set in LA. And why that's so interesting is that historically LA has had a really big Asian population, but you're thinking by the time of the future, because these things were made in 1980, there's already a significant Asian American population in the US when these works are created. Like, Chinese laborers literally helped create like so much of the infrastructure in America. Asian people, East Asian people, have been in America for ages at this point, since the mid 1800s. So by the 1980s, you do have a lot of Asian communities that are actually born in America. And in the future of 2013 for Cyberpunk, going up to 2077, and Blade Runner, which goes from 2019 to 2049, you'd think that the Asian kind of communities would have more of an identity, because although you often have like communities of like East Asians, like generally like Chinatown in London, you also have like various offshoots where you do have distinct, obviously, national identities as well. Like South Korean, South Vietnamese in California like exist, and you know, Orange County for Vietnamese like is quite distinct. So it feels weird that the whole Asian aesthetic in Cyberpunk is so foreign, and it plays into the fear of the Asian takeover. Like, these people aren't really seen as American. They're all seen as like something other. They've come over to, I don't know, take American jobs, take over the whole of America, make LA basically seem like Tokyo or Hong Kong. And that's kind of like the xenophobia in Cyberpunk, is that it doesn't really make an effort to distinguish these people between each other. Like the guy who makes the eyes in Blade Runner, he's a Chinese American actor, but then you have the stuff with the geisha, you have more Japanese stuff as well. But to people who don't have much of a knowledge, it all just blends into one. And for Ridley Scott and whoever else worked in the film, they've blended it together to make this cyberpunk aesthetic, which still exists today. Like, I was just reading about this before, because I think someone tried to correct me before. There's a gang called the Tiger Claws in Cyberpunk 2077, and there isn't anything done to distinguish these people as either like Americans or different from each other. So in the actual description in the game that you can find on the Shard, it says Night City is a melting pot of cultures and ethnicities, but when it comes to its Asian demographic, the Chinese and Japanese influence are unmistakable, as are the Tiger Claws. As a gang, the Tiger Claws are well organised, tech-savvy, but also unpredictable. Their business decisions are purely rational, but when it comes to their enemies or a disloyal gang member, their methods can be shocking. The Tiger Claws mainly operate out of Japantown, Little China, Kabuki, and Charter Hill. So although Tiger Claws have this like more like Japanese aesthetic, it feels like they're kind of a mesh of a lot of East Asian like cultures. Now, this doesn't really bode well for like disproving what I'm saying, but in a recent piece, before we get into like the politics of the creator, Gareth Edwards talked about why he was drawn to Southeast Asia. Like, the whole film is pretty much set in Thailand. And he gave an interview to Inverse, and it writes here, Edwards already had a perfect canvas in mind for his sci-fi epic, Southeast Asia. He fell in love with the region as a kid, comparing the experience of visiting Thailand to George Lucas watching Kurosawa movies and recycling those concepts in Star Wars. It blew my mind. It was the closest thing for me as going to another planet. Southeast Asia marries those two things that George Lucas did so well. You take the ancient past like spirituality and mythology, and you marry it with the far future spaceships and robots. Like, he's actually saying that he's doing techno-Orientalism here. And this goes on to say, I didn't have time to ask whether Edwards consulted cultural experts from these countries he was paying homage to, or whether equating a whole geographic region to a different planet was wise. But Edwards and his VFX team certainly did their research, scouting out locations, which was shot in Thailand. So he wanted it to look different and exotic, but also incorporate the look of these fantastic locations in Southeast Asia. It was really trying to take what was already in the frame and futurize it and make it more exotic, but to not lose sight of the phenomenal locations that we started with as a backbone. So this whole piece was written by Huai Tran Bui, and she's the entertainment editor at Inverse itself. So those statements by Gareth didn't really fill me with confidence that he's aware of what Orientalism even is, because he's pretty comfortable describing, yeah, I want to marry these two things together. And the marriage of those two things together isn't necessarily like a bad thing. But what I think is so much worse is, we're going to talk about the film now. Like I said earlier, the whole of Asia, I'm pretty sure, is called New Asia. I heard one of the characters say New Southeast Asia, but I heard a lot of people say New Asia in the film. Like, it's all one country. I'm not even joking. In the film, India, China, Southeast Asia, apparently, are all one country. And in the description for the film, just so I don't get this wrong, The story is set in 2065, begins with a montage recapping the last several decades during which AI robots were birthed as an enslaved underclass, and allegedly retaliated against the US by nuking LA, which you see in the film. This led to an ongoing war between the US and the newly formed Asian territory known as the Republic of New Asia, a future nation-state seemingly made up of every contemporary Asian country. And I've read some more stuff saying that as well. So yeah, that's basically the premise of the film. It starts with like this newsreel showing the development of AI, which isn't AI in the way we think of it. It literally is like just robots and Android type things rather than like an AI computer program. And basically they nuke LA. They set off a nuke. And in the film it becomes clear what this nuke is meant to represent is September 11th and the Gulf of Tonkin. Because later on, one of the leaders of the AI in Asia says we didn't even do that. It's their own fault. It was like some computer software program malfunctioning or their own code that caused the nuke to go off. So we didn't even do that, which resembles things like WMDs and Gulf of Tonkin, but also September 11th in that in the film, it's a critique of US imperialism. They use this attack to do everything they want. They have this like flying spaceship thing called Nomad that goes around the world and just launches missiles at targets of AI. Don't care about civilian deaths, they just launch them in. And it's meant to be a critique of obviously like US imperialism in the 21st century. And we're going to come back to that because there's massive problems with that. And I do commend the film to show the US actions as being like evil. And it is a criticism of US imperialism. This guy clearly does not think US foreign policy is a good thing. But as I said at the start, he plays into very problematic either Orientalist tropes or just problems with these war movies. Now, in terms of the Orientalism of the setting, like New Asia, like come on. All these countries would be unified in this future. All of them. India, China, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia. None of these countries have issues with each other. They will all unite because they just like robots. I find that like very hard to believe. It's more so he both didn't want to annoy maybe a certain country, or he's really so unimaginative with his geopolitics, which Cyberpunk often does well. Like the geopolitics of 2077 are very interesting, very nuanced, very detailed. This is like, yeah, New Asia. All those Asians are the same. They all hate American like the AI, and they all are just like a canvas for US imperialism. Like, I really don't get this decision at all. If you're gonna do this, I think first of all, you have to limit it. So if it was the Republic of New Southeast Asia or something, and the film maybe explained it a tiny bit, maybe I'd have a bit more sympathy. But then the film goes on to like jump through so many locations, you don't even know where you are. You don't know what country this is. I don't know where I am in the world. Like I hear people speaking Vietnamese, so I think that's Vietnam. Then I hear people speaking Thai in another scene. But then you see all this futuristic architecture, you see shanty towns, and you see stuff that there is really nothing distinguishing these countries from each other. They're all just a blob which is meshed in together, and that's the problem. Like, why are these people all just put in together? At least with even Marvel movies, they invent new European countries, right? And the problem is the power dynamic as well. Like, Southeast Asia doesn't have a super powerful film industry, right? So like I said, even people like myself, until you actually go there and experience like life there, you can't tell about the nuances because you don't see it in your media, where so many people see European media. Like, how big is like Nordic noir? You have obviously like French film is massive, you have American film, British film, even things like Irish film, and people can kind of get the cultural differences. But to a lot of people in the West, we don't know the differences. Like, we don't know the differences between Southeast Asian countries, and then you're just giving us the new version of the Orient. It literally just is the Orient. There is really no attempt to represent any sort of Southeast Asian identity. It is just all a blob together, and I think that's probably one of the worst aspects of the film, because it takes every trope of cyberpunk and takes the worst of it, right? Like, it doesn't even have the redeeming politics of it, really. Like I said, you will have a scene in a country which looks very futuristic, like this city, but then you hear people speaking like Thai or Vietnamese, but all the writing on everything is like Chinese or Chinese alphabet, and then you know, like, that wouldn't happen if this is Thailand or if this is Cambodia or if this is Vietnam. Sure, you'll see a lot of Japanese stuff, but in Vietnam, everything is written in English alphabet because that's the alphabet they use, right? But this guy, Gareth Edwards, he says he loves Southeast Asia and he's been there, but it feels like he might like it as going on holiday to the Thai Islands or something, but it doesn't seem like he really respects it. And now let's get into the whole problem of he's basically redoing the Vietnam War in this futuristic world. Now, there are some interesting parts in that because you clearly see the references to Platoon, Apocalypse Now. I do like the scene when they're coming in that like aircraft, and instead of playing like Fortunate Son, they're playing Everything's in Its Right Place by Radiohead. Gives it like a very eerie vibe, and I like that it's actually played out of the helicopter. Like the thought of these soldiers going into battle, listening to a song from like the early 2000s, but it actually is like 60 something years old to them or whatever. I don't know, I kind of like that. I commend a film for criticizing US imperialism, but it plays into the same problems with US film in general. Like Platoon is a good movie. Apocalypse Now, good movie. They have a good political message, but just like those movies that came out so long ago, now you have another movie where every Asian character is basically a victim to US imperialism, but they don't even have any identity now. We don't really know anything about them. We don't know who they are. So in one of the early scenes of the movie, these American soldiers rock up to some Vietnamese village. It's literally the scene from Platoon where Sergeant Barnes is threatening to shoot that kid, right? It's the same, but in this one, he's threatening to shoot a dog. Like, that's a horrible scene, but you're basically just reenacting the Vietnam War on these Vietnamese people. And then later on, you just see them killing civilians whenever they feel like it, like just shooting people, running. And basically, Vietnamese people have always been depicted in Western film as screaming victims or sinister villains, right? That is what you get. I mean, Asian people in general do have that throughout time, but with Vietnamese in particular, if you watch something like The Deer Hunter, it's like a cartoon. Vietnamese people are so evil in that, but it doesn't even give any nuance. Like, we don't really understand why they're so mad. And in this film, you literally have further victimization of Vietnamese on screen with no nuance at all. So basically, most Vietnamese people you see in this are being killed by American soldiers, or they're women and children fleeing while being shot by American tanks, right? Again, like, I thought we'd move past this, and even I said to my girlfriend afterwards, we see like the robot resistance fighting back. Like, the US absolutely dominate them. Like, the US kills so many people in this film. And I was saying to my girlfriend as well, like, I would have liked to see the resistance be a bit more effective, considering if we are dragging up Vietnam War tropes, these people won, and they're literally just being slaughtered by these US soldiers. Like, they cannot fight back at all. They have no way of fighting back, which plays into their techno-Orientalism, is that this new Asia is so advanced, it can make robot people who have like feelings and can fight, but for some reason, they have no way to combat conventional US firepower. They're so smart and advanced in one way, but they can't defend themselves. And that's another point as well, which I find like pretty gross, right? So Vietnam won the war. The NLF, the North Vietnamese, they won the war, right? They overthrew imperialism. They got their independence. They created their own country. And you think that would maybe matter somewhat. And because the politics are so vague, I don't know the timeline of this film. So in my head, I'm thinking, well, the Vietnam War happened. Vietnam won. And they won, so they would never have to suffer this kind of imperialism again. But in the film, the US just go to Vietnam and do what they want. They go to Southeast Asia and do absolutely anything they want. Even though we know in the context of the film, they're basically like at war with a lot of Asia. So why aren't these people defending themselves? Or why is there no infrastructure to defend themselves? Like, this communist revolution overthrew the American-backed Southern government and got rid of the American destruction of his country, right? I don't know, it feels like a bit of a slap in the face that you both take the worst aspects of Vietnam War films where there's no nuance to the Vietnamese, they're all evil or victims, but you put that in the future after the Vietnamese have freed themselves of its imperialism, but now they're just victims again. So even 100 years on, in 2070, all the Vietnamese people are, by and large, to America, are either guerrilla soldiers, like they are in this film, with their robot friends, or they are victims to US imperialism. And that is all that ever happens to the Vietnamese in Western cinema. So yeah, it combines the worst of Orientalism with the worst of just like flat out like imperialist propaganda, not realizing that in the Western imagination, that is basically all we see Vietnamese as in media, right? All we see is either Viet Cong, or we see screaming women and children being shot at, and even something like The Five Bloods, which I thought did a pretty good job at showing like how normal Vietnam is as a country and like how developed it is in many ways. Even that has that element of, yeah, let's just, for comedic effect, just have a scene of our soldiers just shooting a bunch of Vietnamese soldiers as they talk about like how much they love their girlfriend and stuff. And this film has this problem too, where it plays the slaughter of Asians for even like a comedic effect. Like, you have this one scene at the end. These 3 Buddhist monk robots come up to the US dropship. The US run out, bang, bang, bang. No second thought, right? By the film's logic, these are Asian people as well. These robots, right? They're the same as us. AI is the same as us. And they believe in Buddhism. I honestly think it's meant to be funny with how abrupt it is because they look like they're idiots. Oh, so naive Asian people. Here come the Americans. You go out to pray to them and they just shoot you. So again, I feel like this film has just the weirdest politics ever. And I feel like it could only be made by a Western liberal man, because he clearly isn't well read on the politics enough that he realizes that, oh yeah, like, you know, maybe I should give a bit of nuance here. Maybe I shouldn't make all Asia the exact same country, call it a different planet. And maybe if there's a group of people, naming the Vietnamese, that have been shown as victims in Hollywood since the 1960s and 70s, maybe I should do something a little more to give them some agency, some character, some identity, rather than lumping them in with New Asia and the whole of Southeast Asia, and literally recycling horrible scenes from Platoon, like literally taking the scene from Platoon, sticking it in my movie, and not really explaining why the US can still go around and just do whatever it wants, including to Vietnam, like I said, a country beat them in an actual war in real life. People might be saying, oh dude, it's like a cyberpunk movie in the future. Why are you getting mad if there's no like communist government in Vietnam? But my point is, it's just so vague. I'm assuming this is set like 45 years in the future, like our future or something, because I haven't been told different. So of course I'm gonna assume the communist government in Vietnam lasted for a while longer, but how did it become like a just massive blob of all of Asia together? Countries that hate each other, countries that have never got on, like India and China, or Vietnam and China. There is no nuance here, and that's the problem, because it dehumanizes people in one way. It erases so many cultures, so many nuances, just to have it as a background to US imperialism and US slaughter. Also, the amount of violence inflicted on Asian people in this movie. Personally, I don't think a Western filmmaker would ever depict some sort of war movie like this for Europeans. I just don't think it, because I think there's a subtle dehumanization because we see Asians as victims of war in so much of our media. And a big one is Vietnam. The Vietnam War is a subgenre, massive. Like how many really famous movies, literally some of the most famous movies of all time are set in this, where you just see Vietnamese people gunned down. And this is in video games too, and it's not strictly related just to Vietnamese people. You have Black Ops, Call of Duty Black Ops, where you can just like gun down hundreds of Vietnamese people who all run at you in a line, very easy. And you also have, obviously, throughout Western cinema and Western media, the new big baddie, Arab Muslims. And in those films, you see these people gunned down constantly, and like the Vietnamese in the past, they're either evil caricature or women and children being shot at by Americans or some sort of insurgent group, right? And although you don't realize it in your head, as someone who's never been to these countries, or as someone who knows nothing about them, that becomes, like Edward Said so nicely pointed out, the knowledge. The colonizer tells a story about the colonization, tells you what these people are like, then you watch that film and it becomes your knowledge, because what else do you know about these places? You don't know anything, right? So seeing Vietnamese people slaughtered by US servicemen in a film isn't even that shocking, because you're like, oh, I've seen this a million times. But if this was the US government going into a village in the UK and just shooting loads of random people, that would be more shocking for us to see. We're conditioned to not even think that's a possibility. Whereas with Vietnam, it's like, oh yeah, Americans going back there and shooting missiles at loads of people and just running into a village shooting everyone. I've seen this before, and it's not shocking, and I feel like it's normal, because it normalizes this level of violence to colonize people. And Gareth Edwards, for his good intentions with the left-wing politics of the film in some ways, has really played into this. And I feel like you can make the point the film makes without dehumanizing Asian people, and this is what the film does. And that's something Cyberpunk just constantly does. But I think The Creator is literally so much worse than anything before it. Worse than Blade Runner, worse than anything you find in Cyberpunk, the tabletop, or the game, because it blends in the worst of Orientalism with the worst of imperialist filmmaking, where you both erase the identity of these people and they just become faceless victims with no agency. And I think in that way, the film does come across quite racist, in my opinion. But anyway, that is it for Techno-Orientalism and my critique review of The Creator. I do think the film is good in certain ways. I will say the robot design is, sick. Like, it's so cool. A lot of work went into it. And there are some cool things about the movie. But I would go in with a critical eye. Like, I didn't even really talk about the central plot with this guy and this kid and stuff, because I didn't really want to spoil that part of the movie. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.